Hello, everyone, and welcome to Political Frenemies. Great to have you with us, whether you're watching on YouTube or your smart TV, or whether you're listening on one of the many podcast platforms that carries our podcast. Great to be with you. We are the podcast where a Liberal Democrat and a Conservative discuss the week's politics and the fate of the four main political parties. I guess we should really say, Chris, and I'll introduce you momentarily. I guess we should really say the four main kind of England and Wales wide political parties, because I appreciate that. Obviously, four main English parties really, because in Wales and Scotland they have a different political setup. So I guess we should make that clear. But I'm Mathew Hulbert. I'm a Lib Dem activist and former Lib Dem councillor. And of course, I'm here with Dr. Chris Newton, academic and former defence policy advisor to the Conservatives when they were last in opposition. Now, Chris, obviously, it's a bit weird now being back to just me and you after having a certain Ian Dale with us last week. But there's been really good reaction to that episode, hasn't there?
Yeah, hello, Matthew. As we'd like to extend our thanks again to Ian Dale for his appearance last week. And yes, he, as we'd expect, he'd come out with some really insightful comments and perspectives, especially on Thatcher and Badenoch. And I'm particularly glad that we didn't ask the obvious questions. I don't think we asked about Thatcher's opposition years and Thatcher's life after Downing Street. So hopefully we added something a little bit different there. But thanks for your comments. We've had some really good comments on that, and that's we appreciate that immensely. And hopefully we'll do more of these kind of things in the future.
Well, we might just have a little bit of an announcement at the end of this podcast. So stay with us, folks. Don't go anywhere, because we might just have some news for you. But yeah, we've also seen, certainly in terms of the YouTube figures, that was our, and this doesn't surprise me at all, but that was really our best podcast yet in terms of YouTube viewers. So yeah, just absolutely delighted about that. And thanks again to Ian Dale. So, I guess we ought to get into what has been, again, Chris, another really busy week.
Yeah, just to say before we get into it, I mean, as we say, we've fully sort of determined that our remit is Westminster politics and the four Westminster parties. As to add to what you said earlier, but this has been a big week, sort of internationally and in terms of the world outside Westminster. We've had riots in in a place in Northern Ireland. We had that awful plane crash, Gatwick bound, but it occurred in India. Just absolutely horrific. And we're also having Israeli airstrikes on Iran and Iranian drone strikes on Israel. And at the time of recording on Friday evening, there are, as we speak, further Israeli attacks on targets in Iran. So like I say, I know I'm a defense expert, but our remit is purely now sort of Westminster politics. But it was worth mentioning those, because those were big stories during the course of the week.
They absolutely were, and a big week globally, a big week domestically as well, which is what we'll focus on. So shall we do it, Chris?
Yep, let's go.
So we will start with Labour this week. Of course, they are the government. Those are the ones that can actually do stuff rather than just say stuff. And talking about doing stuff this week, Chris, the biggest moment was, of course, for Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, in case you didn't know, and I'm sure you do by now. It was, of course, her spending review. Now, we have to just say, this is presented as if it's a budget. Of course, it isn't the budget, but it's something very important indeed, where she sets out what each department will get. Well, she didn't necessarily say that in the speech, but we get to know which departments have won and which have lost, to use Westminster media parlance. Yeah, I mean, a lot came out of that. The NHS seemed to do well, and I'll have some comments on that momentarily. Defence seemed to do well. The Home Office, not so well, Chris. So, I mean, what were your initial thoughts on the spending review?
Yeah, I think your assessment there, sort of health, defence, Home Office, also announcements for education, social and affordable housing, as well. And yes, I think the big winners were health and defence. Although, as a defence expert, plenty of us are saying 2.5%, 2.6% in this parliament still is insufficient given the degree of threats that we face, and there's still uncertainty over 3% in the next parliament. So there are still concerns regarding that. And the Home Office, or at least policing advocates, have similar comments as well to make on policing. There was a big row between Cooper and Reeves over whether what was being allocated was enough in terms of policing. But in saying that, the government has announced a whole raft of spending measures, lots of spending measures. We mentioned last week the partial U-turn on the winter fuel payments and so forth. And I just don't see how any of this is sustainable. And at the moment, they seem to be getting away with it. And there's no big market reaction like in 2022. There's no big sort of media panic as well. It just seems to be one rule for Labour and one rule for the Tories and Reform. And I'm sure at some point all of this spending will come back to bite them. Would you say, or are you not as concerned about the degree of spending than I am?
Well, I'm not. I mean, I think this is what should have been announced last year. And we both commented on this podcast, Chris, that Rachel Reeves boxed herself in. And in my view, she unnecessarily boxed herself in. I mean, she talks about spending limits, etc., and the fiscal rules and all of that. These are things that she set herself. And I appreciate that having to admit that she was wrong isn't easy, and of course you'd take a political hit for that. But it's easier than trying to do what she's doing at the moment, which is to stay within those fiscal rules and increase spending. I don't think you can do both of those things. And so, of course, the right wing, I'm not saying necessarily you, Chris, but the right wing more generally, absolutely attack her, and yet the kind of to the left of her, people say that they're not doing enough, and so she doesn't win in any way. Now, you may say that she's trying to kind of attract the sensible centre. Well, maybe she is, but I don't know how big a portion of the electorate that really is anymore. People tend to take entrenched views, and so I'm not sure she really wins either way. Now, I mean, there are a number of things that I welcome. Given my history and what happened to my dear mum. And if you don't know about that, there's plenty of it online. You can Google. I won't repeat it again on this podcast. But, I absolutely welcome the fact that more money has gone into the NHS. No doubt you'll disagree with me on this, Chris, but I still believe that I'm afraid it's not enough, that our NHS, as I said on Sky News last week, I mean, the fact is this is a health service in a modern Western democracy serving tens of millions of people, people that are, and this is a good thing obviously, but people that are living till much older ages, and therefore have more and more kind of things wrong with them that the NHS has to deal with, and that can't be done on the cheap. The fact is that it does take a lot of money to fund such a health service. And
we
my
are
view
we are
is that,
spending nearly 200. Sorry, we are spending nearly 200 billion on health already. Surely that's. I mean, that's governments, other departments would kill to have that kind of money.
Yeah, they would, but we're still falling short of the European average, which I certainly believe, and I'm sure you disagree, Chris, but I mean, I certainly believe that the last Labour government took us to the European average on health spending. To be fair to Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and I think I would hope that this Labour government does the same. Now, you may say that we're in a different set of economic circumstances, and of course we are, but government can always find the money when it needs to find the money. So these are political choices, not just economic ones. So, but any increase in health spending is very welcome, and there's been money specifically announced to help with emergency care, and obviously the issue of ambulances, which was the issue for my mum. So I really welcome that, because I definitely hope that more families don't go through what my family did, Chris.
Would you cut spending elsewhere or raise taxes? And do you have an idea of kind of where the money could be raised for extra health spending?
Well, I wonder. I mean, I'm in two minds in regards to the defence spending, because I do appreciate. Of course, I do. I'm not stupid. Of course, I appreciate that we live in a very dangerous world. Of course, I recognise that there's war within Europe at the moment with the dreadful situation in Ukraine, wholly caused by Vladimir Putin and his regime in Russia. Of course, I recognise the situation in the Middle East and other trouble spots as well. I don't deny that. I'm not saying that defence spending shouldn't be increased, but by how much, I think, is an open question, and I certainly don't think it should be by 5%, as Donald Trump seems to want. And I also don't think it should be on the backs of the poorest in the world. So I don't think it should be as a result of cutting the aid budget. I think there should be a way to properly fund defence, and to properly fund what was DFID. Obviously, it's now part of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, but the development part of government spending, at least, in my view, absolutely should be zero. Should still be, as it was under the Liberal Democrats in coalition. And I think it was primarily the Lib Dems that led on this, although no doubt you would say, Chris, that it couldn't have happened without the Conservatives agreeing, because of course it was a coalition. But in my view, it should still be at 0.7% of defence of GDP spending, because actually I think that is more the soft power. You may be more in favour, Chris, of the hard power.
When we were in opposition, I was one of the few voices arguing against that, but and others and increasing defence spending, but or at the very least making it law. But anyway, that's well into the past now.
But don't you think that there is like people say about the World Service as well, and other things, that soft power is important, and in its own way, it's as important as hard power, as kind of military and all the rest of it.
I think I think still the ultimate tool of statecraft is hard power, but if you look at history, it has to be used for it to be used effectively. And I have talked, of course, for example, on the British strategy in the 19th century, is always accompanied by other factors, and military force is always sort of used within, with other political measures in order to be effective. On overseas aid, look, I don't have anything against overseas aid as a tool, again, as a tool of grand strategy, as a tool of statecraft, and the Chinese do it very effectively. The problem is that the British don't use aid in strategic terms, whereas China uses aid to establish control over key strategic areas. We see it as a moral mission, and that's all very well and good.
Quite right too.
Well, it's all very well and good, but in a Cold War scenario, ultimately the states that gain power and control over the key strategic areas and choke points are the people who will use it more strategically and use it to their favor. Well, there's one other point I want to address, because I could feel people coming through the screen saying, well, how comes this guy 1 minute is talking about increasing defense spending, and then he says that Labour's spending is too much? Isn't that a massive contradiction? And that is a very fair question. That is a very fair question. And what I would say to that is that I think those of us who advocate more increases in defense spending have to be honest in the sense that it will have to we do have to reorientate our economic structure in favor of defense. And I'd say we need to transition from a social democratic model to a patriotic democratic model. And so defense and security has to take priority. And that doesn't mean that the other services aren't important. We just have to think more creatively about how those services are provided. So
But are you really saying, Chris? And this is a question that I was going to ask you in reference to Keir Starmer and him saying that we're going on a war-ready footing. I mean, perhaps I'm naive, and ultimately, you're the defence expert here, so do tell me. But surely any kind of global conflagration now would be disastrous. It'd almost kind of be the end of the world. I just personally can't see it happening.
Well, yes, it would be, and that's why we want to deter it. We don't want to fight it. And that's why you invest in your armed forces. That's why we have a nuclear deterrent, for example, because it's designed to deter people. It's not we don't want to use it. And the paradox is that in order to deter conflict, you have to show that you're able to fight it. So in that sense, yes, it involves a lot of expenditure, but that is how it ultimately works. It's how it worked during the Cold War, how it worked with Britain during the 19th century. So I've never advocated for defence spending to fight a load of wars. I've advocated for defence spending because I've studied it. I don't want to be caught up in one of these things, and therefore I want to do everything that we can to deter it. And yes, soft power is part of that, but ultimately, if you're trying to deter an aggressor, someone who isn't necessarily receptive to soft power, then your other alternative is through hard power and the threat of using force.
And all of that is fair enough. But don't you think that it's then also fair enough, Chris, for lots of people, especially people who are reliant on public services, and obviously there's millions of us for whom that is the case, to say if you can find money for that, you can find money to properly fund schools and hospitals and the police and housing and all the rest of it. Is that not a fair enough argument?
I certainly sympathise with that concern, but what I would say is that the number one duty of government is security and defence. Without security and defence, you don't have the other things. I'm paraphrasing Dennis Healey here, who's not known to be a right winger. So ultimately, in order, because we didn't just wake up today in this relatively prosperous kind of more sort of peaceful sort of society, it's happened on the back of our ancestors fighting for it, and ultimately clever statecraft during the Cold War that prevented us from actually fighting a world nuclear war. And what I would say, yes, the state's ultimate function is security and defence, and it's important that the state has a monopoly of violence. We don't want to, we learned from the Wagner situation that you don't really want to really rely on private forces. but in terms of the other services, you can there is the option to bring in other types of providers, and what's enabled me to advocate defence whilst in ensuring that overall public spending is kept at a sensible level is that I'm perfectly willing to explore other options in terms of the delivery of healthcare,
You
free at
mean
the point of use. Free at the point
you
of
mean
use.
the
I will
private
say
sector,
that.
do you, Chris?
Sorry.
You mean the private sector, do you?
The private sector, the charitable sector as well. I'd even look at it in terms of education as well. Again, free at the point of use, but I don't see why it has to be the state that ultimately delivers the services.
Do you know what the answer to that is, Chris? The answer to that I will give to you right now, and I've rehearsed it many times on the TV interviews that I've done about what I think should happen to the NHS. Is because every time you use the private sector, every time the NHS uses the private sector, so yeah, it's free to the point of use to the patient. But each time that the NHS uses the private sector, it further undermines the NHS as a public service. And so actually it's not, from my point of view at least, it's not really helping the NHS. If it's plugging gaps, then let's properly plug those gaps by properly funding the NHS, which is going back to my point earlier on. And so I think actually anytime the NHS uses the private sector to plug those gaps, it's just an admission of failure that the NHS itself isn't sufficiently funded to be able to do that work without the use of the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think we just see it very differently. I mean, is
Right.
like, if other sectors being brought in, I'm the concern is whether what this affects that would have on the reputation of the NHS. Just, it doesn't really concern me because I think, I don't care what provider it is. If it provides healthcare at a good level, at an efficient level, then it doesn't matter to me whether it's state or private. So we just have a fundamental disagreement there.
Yeah, and we do, and that's what this podcast is all about. Before we get on to the other parties, I mean, what about the politics of this week then, Chris, in terms of for Labour? I mean, I hope this doesn't sound kind of in any way kind of. I really hope it doesn't sound in any way kind of nasty or anything, but because I really wouldn't want it to. But I find it really hard to listen to Rachel Reeves. I don't think she's a good communicator. I think it's almost as if she's had too much media training and it's become kind of like robotic. I don't think she connects with people, which I think you have to do in that kind of role. Even more so than Starmer, he's a bit like this himself. But I kind of think that Rachel Reeves is worse. And I've listened to her a lot this week. I obviously listened to the Spending Review speech. I've heard many of her interviews, and I end up focusing on kind of how she speaks rather than what she's saying, and that's not a good position for her to be in.
Yeah, I mean, it's exacerbated by the fact that she's having to make these U-turns on the winter fuel payments, and she's just her role. I don't know what happens to her when the red light comes on, but it's not a let's just say it's quite a painful watch a lot of the time, and she gives the impression that she's like a rabbit in the headlights kind of thing. I don't know whether her position is under threat. It doesn't seem to be. I mean, if the situation is if the situation is as I stated is, if this spending review and all of the announcements unravel and the markets do panic, but it seems her position is secure for the moment.
Don't you think, Chris, that as much as I think that she probably should go, actually, and I said that on Twitter this week, the trouble for Keir Starmer, because of course he's the only one that can sack her, he's the Prime Minister, or move her, probably more than sack her, is that in a sense, it would undermine him, would it not?
It would undermine him, but because and this is something that Ian Dow said last week as well on this show, and but I would say maybe he could just get away with it. I mean, he will be damaged by it. He'll be severely damaged by it. But the relationship between Starmer and Reeves, I don't see it in the same way as the relationship between Truss and Kwarteng, or Cameron and Osborne, or
Right.
Blair and Brown. They don't seem to be joined at the hip in that way. And Starmer has kept himself rather distant from Reeves's announcements. So I think actually Starmer could actually get away with
And do you think we could see Chancellor of the Exchequer streeting? What do you think? Who?
I was thinking about this, and I would put someone in there who's been around a long time, and it's someone like Douglas Alexander.
That would be very interesting.
Just someone who is, given the whole chaos of the last year, just someone who's regarded as a safe pair of hands and can steady the ship a bit. So I would go for someone like that rather than,
or maybe Darren Jones, the current Chief Secretary.
Well, he made a big blunder this week on Question Time, which has got him and into quite a bit
in regards
of PR
to immigration,
trouble.
Yes.
Yeah. It's basically saying that the small group, the majority of the small boat crossings are women and children, which is just factually incorrect. So he is regarded as a pretty good media performer, and what we mean by that is he can regurgitate a line pretty effectively, but he's shot himself in the foot a bit this week.
So do Labour end the week any better off politically, electorally than they started the week, or not?
I don't detect any kind of that. I mean, this is the same as last week, and the point I was trying to make last week is that yes, there's been quite a few embarrassing decisions being made, but you don't get a kind of a really terrible write up in the media this week, do you? So I think if anything, it's a bit of a draw, even though if you look at the announcements, if you look at the U-turns, if you look at on defence, the idea that the strategic defence review is properly funded is laughable. But again, they seem to get away with it, don't they?
They absolutely do. I mean, each week I ask myself, are the public looking at the government again? Are they giving them a second chance? I don't think we're there yet. And maybe it won't happen until we get a new chancellor in place. And I absolutely think that Douglas Alexander is a good shout. That who knows? We may well, I say we, the royal we there, Chris. It was actually you. But Chris may well turn out to be right about that.
I don't understand why he's a minister of state. He's a minister of state, isn't he?
Absolutely. I mean, I always thought that he was a good media performer, as you say, a safe pair of hands, a bit dry in that sense, but I think you need someone like that, and someone that I think people broadly like if they know about him at all, and that that can take people with them on a journey, so to speak. So we'll see what happens with that. But shall we turn to the Tories week? And yes, we are doing the Tories second this week for the first time in quite a few weeks, which tells its own tale. We are doing the Tories now rather than Reform, who we'll get to momentarily. So obviously we had their response to the spending review from the Shadow Chancellor. I mean, I thought that was a little bit performative, Chris, and I appreciate it's a big occasion. It's always going to get a lot of media coverage, but I thought it was a little bit synthetic anger from the Shadow Chancellor. What do you think, Mel Stride?
Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of thing you'd expect from, and the kind of thing that you'd expect him to say, and he's kind of got to give a performance like that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with his delivery in the Commons. I think is regarded as a pretty good performer in the Commons. But my question with him is, I mean, he set himself up. If you look at his past record, he kind of made his name for himself, being a thorn in the side of like Boris and Truss, and so forth. And now he's trying to sort of convince us that he's going to be like a radical chancellor, or I don't know what kind of chancellor he wants to be, quite frankly. And I think that's part of the problem. But I find it, put it this way, I find it very difficult that to believe that he's going to be kind of a new trend sort of setter, sort of radical chancellor that will smash the consensus and deliver a new kind of economic arrangement that would fix everything.
Yeah, and he apologised for the Liz Truss years, didn't he? Now, in a sense, did he not have to do that, Chris? I mean, for him to be taken seriously by a lot of voters, did he not have to do that?
Yeah, I mean, given the narrative about it, I suppose he felt, and the party felt, that they had no choice. Although I would like to hear a more sort of complex account of that budget, because and to smash this idea that tax cuts automatically lead to market panics and so forth. The Thatcher years ultimately it disproves that, and there's a danger that people are just going to remember the trust budget as opposed to what Thatcher did in the 80s.
But it was,
I don't have time to go into the trust budget,
no,
but I would like
indeed,
at some point to
but Thatcher did what she did over a number of years. Did it all. I mean, I don't agree with it anyway, but even if you agree with her philosophy and what she was trying to do, it was all very rushed, and the markets just got spooked. That's the truth of it.
There was the LDI crisis. There was the big spending on energy support, which is completely forgotten, and there was the fact that she announced all of these measures without the corresponding tax cuts. And a lot of it was going to be funded through borrowing, and you might say, well, tax cuts ultimately would ultimately give you a return, and that's true. But as Truss found out herself, we live in a very skeptical environment with regards to tax cuts and kind of traditional sort of Tory tax policy, and therefore a more cautious approach would have been better in my opinion in that regard.
Now, I wanted to ask you about another moment this week, which actually came before the spending review, which was in Prime Minister's question. So it's the one Wednesday where PMQs is not the most important thing that happens. But I thought there was an interesting moment when Keir Starmer said, and obviously Labour are going to raise Liz Truss at every given opportunity. I totally understand why they do that. But I thought it was an interesting and really correct point that Keir Starmer made when he said, the Tories, the Shadow Chancellor has condemned the Liz Truss years, and yet look, sat on the front bench. Who is that? It's her Chief Secretary, who's now the Shadow Home Secretary, Chris Philp. I mean, he's got a point there, hasn't he? I mean, people are not going to forget those years when there was her number two, still sat very prominent in a shadow Great Office of State.
Yeah, I don't know if whether the public will get hung up on sort of personnel at that level of detail. I mean, what I would say to that, what I would advise the Tories to do is firstly point out the spending of Labour, point out that the gilt rates I think are higher than what they were during Truss's time. I would like to hear sort of a complex account of what happens. The good, but basically on the lines that I said. But also I think what would also be effective. Okay, if Labour's going to remind everyone of the trust time, fine. But I hope that the tourism reform will remind everybody at every turn that British taxpayers are ultimately paying for Mauritian tax cuts, and that, which I think is an absolutely disgraceful state of affairs. And I think if the tourism reform, keep banging that and just telling them that their taxes are going to not even to the benefit of themselves, then I think that could be potentially toxic over time.
Now, another interesting moment at Prime Minister's Questions was that Kemi Badenoch told us herself, and I thought this was hilarious, told us herself that she was getting better every week at Prime Minister's Questions. Now, part of me thinks that, she protested too much, that obviously that's been on her mind. I think from her point of view, she probably did do better this week than she has in a while. And she just seemed, I made the point this week, Chris, and I know that you said that I was being my usual fair and balanced self, and of course I always am. But I said this week that she comes in and does the real political stuff, or at least tries to, and then Ed Davey, very statesmanlike, asks about actual policy matters for the benefit of the British people. But from her perspective, at least as leader of the opposition, I mean, do you think that what she says is true, that she is getting better every week?
I certainly think over the past few weeks, in terms of her delivery, it's definitely got better. There's much more passion there. There's much more fire there, and I like that, and I'd like to see more of that. There's definitely much more energy there. And I think one of the criticism of her was that she was pretty low energy. The last week especially, she definitely got more passionate. I think in terms of the topic she went on, I don't think there was anything really wrong with the topic she went on this week. The only thing I would pick up on with her with PMQs last week was that I think when he was talking about Chagos, when Starmer was talking about Chagos, and this whole ridiculous notion that if you oppose it, then you're on the side of China, even though China's welcomed it, and Russia, even though they've just signed a deal with Mauritius on fishing and marine research and so forth. I would like to have her to have pressed him more on that, and to have her come back on that. But I think she is getting better, and as we were talking about last week, we'll have to see whether she has the time, or she's allowed the time to develop. As I've always said, there's something there. She has potential, but unfortunately, this is not the time for slow burners.
Right. Now, did you also want to mention the ECHR, Chris?
Yeah. I know we're I know we're sort of pressed for time because you've got something, but I mean, this could be saved for another day. But I just thought it was interesting what Ian Dow said last week about and this has actually been reinforced in some reports of potential defections to the Liberal Democrats as well this week, and is interesting. Ian Dow is, in some respects, it's quite depressing in the sense that there are people thinking of leaving the party over this issue. But as I said last week, this is a fundamental issue. The issue of having control of your borders is not an issue that you can sweep under the carpet, and it's absolutely essential, especially given the numbers that are coming across the channel even today. Very very high numbers. So it's a shame that I do struggle to. It's a fundamental issue. It's not something that you can fudge. You either you either say, right, we're going to police our borders and going to take the necessary means to do that, or not, essentially. But
Chris, it's how you do it,
Mm.
and it's the language you use, and it's the tone that you set. And I think, if we do see, and we'll come on to my party in a wee bit, but if we do see defections to the Lib Dems from current kind of One Nation centrist, centre-right Conservative MPs, it'll be because they feel that their party and the rhetoric being used has just gone too far.
Well, I mean, that's why I think Badenoch's approach, even though politically you might think, well, there's a lot of questions being asked, or is this another fudge in terms of her, announcing this review? But I think her approach in terms of, well, we're going to set out the proper reasons for the policy when it's decided, is probably the best approach, even though there is understandable skepticism as to what the from the right and from people who want to leave the ECHR as to what the policy will eventually be.
Because she needs to keep the broad tent, doesn't she, ultimately? And I mean, you might question how much of a broad tent the Tories are these days, but there are still kind of more to the centre-right Conservative MPs.
It goes back to the question: can you square the circle in today's environment? I totally get Ian Dale's point about, yes, there were a lot of seats lost to the Liberal Democrats at the last election, but is there any way in which you can certainly form a coalition between sort of traditional sort of right-wing Tories and sort of red wall working class socially conservative people? But can you form an alliance with middle class, sort of liberal minded people as well? I'm not quite especially over an issue as stark as the ECHR issue. Maybe if the Tories just focused on delivery and being competent, maybe that's that, and delivering services for people, that might be a way in which to unite the people. But I understand Ian's point about, yes, we would like to get back to the days of the big tent parties, but is our society so fragmented now that that's very difficult to achieve? I'm not quite sure.
Well, Chris, that is why we need PR, and so that we can have smaller parties, and not necessarily the need for a big tent. We have really only got a couple of minutes, I'm afraid, because I've got a social function that I've got to get to. So, but let's get to Reform UK now. Actually, quite a quiet week for them in comparison to previous weeks, but they did have this announcement of their new chair, David Bull, someone that I have met because when I am down at Talk, as I will be this Saturday, doing my commentary bit on Peter Cardwell's show. His show directly follows David Bull's show, and so I've met David Bull in their newsroom, and I've been having my cuppa and going over the briefing papers, and he's always been perfectly pleasant to me and seems like a nice guy. His politics obviously aren't mine, but from what I've seen, a very good communicator. I think he likely will be an asset for reform. He's already been doing the TV and radio round, so I expect him to be doing much more of that, Chris.
Yeah, and I've appeared on his show before. I've always I'm actually sorry to, because I'm a listener of his weekend breakfast show. I'm very sorry to see it go, but I think you're right. He's a very good communicator. He's been. I don't want to say this in a rude manner, but he has been around quite a while. I remember him watching him on stuff like the right stuff. I even though I didn't watch it, I do remember him on was it Most Haunted, the show which he was talking about this week. But he's a really good communicator. I think he's a really good asset for Reform UK, and I think he will give them a bit of a softer image as well, because he's a doctor, he's a trained doctor. But if you listen to him on the radio, he's very caring as well, and showing sort of emotion,
quite a jovial character.
Yeah, and showing emotion and care. I mean, it's not always the right strength, even I'm admitted to that. And I think what people get fed up with the right about is that they want to know, are you on our side? So when the chips are down, it's not out, are you on on our side, but when the chips are down, do you have our backs? And I think the right has to be sort of better at showing that. And I think David Ball is a kind of person who would be able to show that.
Absolutely. I think that's probably that for Reform this week. Not been a massive week for them, and not a great deal to say about the Lib Dems week.
Can I just say,
yeah.
when I send you some suggestions for what we're going to talk about this week, I just put a giant question mark next to the Lib Dems, because I had no idea what they did this week.
I did notice that. Now, they did do stuff this week. I saw our MPs out and about on the media shows that did have them on, that would give the third party some coverage. Thanks, guys. So I saw Al Pinkerton on Newsnight, one of our new intake from last year, who's really good. Obviously, Daisy Cooper was out and about, and she gave the response in the House of Commons. But yeah, it is becoming a little bit of a, and obviously Ed Davey asked, I thought, 2 good questions at PMQs this week. But it is becoming a little bit of a concern that, when I get your obviously very, very well written brief each week, Chris, that because bless him, it is Chris that do that, bless his heart. But there's not necessarily an obvious thing to write about the Lib Dems week, and that is concerning. I don't know if it's just me and thee, Chris, missing stuff that is happening, but we watch a lot of political coverage each week, obviously in preparation for this show, so I don't think it's that. And so it is a bit of a concern that the party isn't doing stuff that obviously, lends itself to being talked about on political podcasts and programs like this. So I'll admit that is a concern, Chris.
Yeah, and there has to be, not necessarily, again, this is very early in the day for actual policy announcements, but any leader of the opposition needs to set direction. They need to set tone. Running around in theme parks isn't really the best. I know it gets attention, but now now the serious stuff has to start about what it is the Liberal Democrats actually stand for, and what are they going to do in terms of any sort of policy review and direction into the next couple of years.
And I agree, and we've said on this podcast before. In fact, both of us have said this. So you don't have to be pro Lib Dem to say this, but it would be good to see Ed Davey doing some kind of platform speeches, and it shouldn't just be twice a year at party conference. I know those are important moments, and the leader's speech does get some media coverage, and that's fine. And I'm hoping to be at our awesome party conference again this year, but between those times, it would be good for him to say, and it would be good to, and even though you, Chris, would obviously disagree with this stuff, is that it would be good for him to say, do a set speech on why we need closer ties with Europe, or do a set speech on something that I don't think we raise nearly enough these days as Lib Dems, when it used to be our raising debt, which is the why we need to see improvements in education, etc., etc., etc. And I do think you used to
like referendums at one point as well, didn't you?
I knew he'd mention. I knew he'd get that in. He just had to. But yeah, I do seriously think, if there's any senior Lib Dems that watch or listen to this podcast, guys, come on, we need to have stuff to talk about each week that isn't just Ed's 2 questions at Prime Minister's Questions, important though they are. We really do need some content from the Lib Dems. So this is a plea, as someone that would like to be able to come on here each week and have a lot to talk about. That hasn't been the case for these past few weeks, and from a Lib Dem perspective, that is a real worry. So I hope, guys, you will get that, guys and girls, and non-binary individuals. I hope you'll get that sorted out. But that has been the political week. We have rattled, although we're on about 50 minutes, so it's not been too much of a rattle through. But as I say, I on the day of recording, I have got somewhere else to be. Now, we talked about letting a little secret out of the bag earlier on. In our podcast next week, we can reveal to you that Peter Cardwell, yes, Peter Cardwell of Talk TV fame now, but also he was an advisor to several government departments in the last Conservative government, and to several secretaries of state. And he literally wrote the book on special advisors, which is well worth a read if you haven't read it thus far, and is writing a new book on the pets of politicians, because Peter famously has a beloved cat, and he's writing a book about the pets of politicians, which should be really, really interesting. I'm hoping that it'll feature some exclusive comments from Larry the cat, Larry the Downing Street cat. So I'm looking forward to that. But yeah, Peter's fantastic. He's also been a producer on Question Time, and he's worked on Newsnight. And yeah, so again, like with Ian Dale, a multi-talented guy, multi-talented individual. And bless his heart, he regularly has me on his show. So, you know, including this Saturday, folks. So we're really looking forward to having Peter on, Chris.
Yeah, no, again, another, absolutely star guest we're going to have. Really looking forward to, because I don't think I've ever encountered him, so it'll be good for me to meet him as well. But yeah, really looking forward to it, and yeah, we're getting all the big names on this show now.
We absolutely are. We're really excited about it, folks. So if you came new to the podcast last week for Ian Dale, as we said last week, we hope that you stayed with us and that you've enjoyed this regular show with me and Chris, and that we hope that you'll stay for Peter Cardwell next week as well, and many other guests being lined up. I should just say, not just right-wing guests. We're going to have some centre-left guests as well. So do look out for that, because I'm certainly looking forward to that. But yeah, do all the internety things, please. Please subscribe, please follow, please like, please follow us on our Twitter account, which is @Frenemies. Please do all of that stuff. And then, yeah, join me, Chris, and Peter Cardwell next week. So from Chris, it's goodbye.
Yeah, goodbye from me.
And from me, goodbye. See you next week on Political Frenemies.